it's Mark Glaser, PBS MediaShift. Welcome to another edition of the Mediatwits. Today we'll be talking about podcasts on our podcast, a very meta show. And why podcasts? Because podcasts seem to be coming back, having a resurgence, and this time with a business model, with a way to be more sustainable. We all remember podcasts kind of rising in the 90s and early 2000s. They were going to be the big wave, and so they've kind of come and gone and now come back again. So we'll be talking about podcasts and a lot of really creative ways of funding podcasts. First, I want to thank our sponsor, NextSpace and NextKids, because running your own business, as you all know, requires a lot of focus. So does parenting. Mediatwits podcast sponsor NextSpace created a place where parents could give their best quality of attention to both co-working space and childcare space under one roof. Learn more at nextspace.us/nextkid. And I am indeed at NextSpace right now, and my one-year-old son Everett is in the NextKids space playing right next door. So podcasting, really, there's a much lower barrier to entry when it comes to podcasting now. The tools are cheaper. You can get potential global distribution through the internet and iTunes. But what is it about podcasting that is working now that wasn't working in the past? I want to introduce our panel. We have Andrew Lih from American University joining us, Fannie Cohen, our producer in New York, Kerri Hoffman, Chief Operating Officer at PRX in Vermont, and Mike Pesca at The Gist at Slate. So a few numbers just to kind of rattle your brain. Now iTunes has basically served up 1 billion subscriptions to podcasts as of last year. RawVoice says that 75 million unique listeners listen to podcasts each month. There's a lot more indie shows coming up and a lot of kind of refugees from radio and from public radio doing their own thing. Mike, you were at NPR for a number of years and made the switch over to Slate. It had something to do with an iPhone adapter not working, I think. But you also mentioned that it had to do with you thought NPR should be a little bit more ambitious. And now you're over at Slate. Do you feel like Slate is being pretty ambitious in what they're doing with podcasts?
Yeah, and I want to say that I'm not a refugee. I'm more of a refusenik. And there is a distinction there. Yeah, they're definitely being ambitious. I think that it's very hard for a huge organization and also, you know, NPR, what's the NPR audience? The NPR audience maybe doesn't want to go to all the places that a podcaster wants to go. You know, a common refrain of an NPR listener is like, I don't want to hear your opinion. And a common refrain of a podcast listener is, I do want to hear your opinion. So even though that there's a lot of overlap and, you know, we have standards of storytelling and we value journalism the same, what a podcast listener wants to get out of a podcast in some ways is fundamentally different from the very basic notion of NPR. And then I also think you have to add into it, well, what's the attitude towards giving offense? And I would say that at NPR they would say, well, we very much don't ever want to give offense or to have turned someone off. Now, there will be exceptions if we say something like, if we journalistically uncover some very uncomfortable truth, we'll go there, but it really has to be justified. Where with a podcast, especially if you have the right boss and the right environment, I think the bottom line is, you know, really be distinctive and almost necessarily piss off a large swath of the potential audience. And if you're not doing that, you're not doing it right. And that's not being obnoxious. It's just that if you're just being so distinctive, the things that we love in media, like now John Oliver or Bill Maher or, you know, Rush Limbaugh, like if they weren't being distinctive, they wouldn't be loved. So I think that's a huge podcast network and NPR difference.
Yeah, and what about being at Slate? I mean, do you feel like you have pretty much total editorial freedom? I mean, do you have the freedom? Do you have limits on what you can do?
The only limits are Andy Bowers, who runs all of the podcasts, he edits. At the end of every show, I do a spiel. So I send him that. I sometimes send him the stuff I say in the beginning, and he'll edit me, but it's almost always a suggestion, and it's always been a good suggestion. And I don't think I've ever, and I've always, the one or two times where he said, "I don't think you want to say this," he's been right. So it's kind of, I can't believe how fantastic the editing process has been. And just little things like, look, you're at 340, you got to get it down to 325. You know, that's just not having to deal with that is so wonderful.
I can imagine. So you don't have a situation like Bill Simmons where, you know, you're going to be suspended if you talk about the NFL.
I think if I dared my bosses to suspend me and I started calling people liars, I might get in trouble.
Right, so you don't want to push it too much. So Kerri, first of all, tell us about PRX, Public Radio Exchange, and what your, kind of what the credo is, what the goal is. I know it's a place where independent kind of audio producers can get distribution in public radio, but it seems like you're kind of going beyond that now and doing a lot more.
Yeah, and just based on what Mike said, we see this all the time. Everybody needs an editor at whatever level of experience they have coming into this. We see that all the time on PRX. So we were founded in 2003 largely as a station-to-station exchange platform, and it was designed with openness in mind so that independent producers could upload their work to a website that was, underlying it was a big database, so that the idea was that there's not enough shelf life for independent work, and so if we create this way, use the benefit of broadband at the time to allow perusing and shopping, maybe program directors would become experimental in their programming. And that experiment has largely been very successful. There's been an explosion of good independent content out there. What we see is what everybody else is seeing, that within the last handful of years, the audience, the mobile technology has just changed where audiences are going. So our credo is, we support people making great content wherever, and we find the audience wherever it may be. We work in broadcast, we work in podcasts, we work in mobile apps, we work in video. We try to be as well-rounded as possible in supporting the creators to find their audiences. And so we've moved from that station-to-station broadcast platform into a producer platform that serves audiences wherever they may be.
And have you seen a resurgence around podcasts? I mean, is there more usage? Is there more listenership through PRX?
Yeah, absolutely. And, in the early days, the most successful podcasts were those that had radio shows. The podcast was really just a rebroadcast of the radio shows. And so what's fascinating now is we're finding new podcasts that are digital first. 99% Invisible is one of those successful podcasts where, there's an audience that has found him digitally. And he does a 4.5-minute version for public radio stations, and he does that. And we also have Remix, where 99% is broadcast on a handful of stations overnight. But most of his success has been direct to listeners, and we see more and more of that every day. And we think that that's a real important area of growth. Sometimes it's shorter, sometimes it's like Mike said, maybe it's more controversial. There's all kinds of freedoms that people have with this medium.
And tell us about Radiotopia, because this is Roman Mars from 99% Invisible has decided to create really a network of audio shows, kind of independent audio shows, and he's done a Kickstarter in the past, maybe just for 99% Invisible, but for Radiotopia. Tell us about the Kickstarter campaign, which is kind of ridiculous in how much money it's raising in such a short period of time, but tell us about that campaign and just what Radiotopia is trying to pull off.
Sure. So Radiotopia, we founded Radiotopia last year, launched it in February, and so just by context, so when we start, we have increased the audience to the shows, there's 7 of them across the board, by about 130%. So it's been a really great success story in terms of reaching more audience. The shows are a mixture. It's anchored by 99% Invisible, which has already had the biggest audience. And then we have a handful of other podcasts that are mostly story-driven, high-quality, public radio refugees doing their own thing. And we also have a podcast from the Kitchen Sisters and Joe Richmond, who does Radio Diaries. And they're real veterans in the public radio world. And so that's been really fascinating to see them take that experience. But podcasting is totally new to them. It's a new medium. It's a new way of talking to their audience. So the intent of Radiotopia was to have a good, healthy, round mix of regularity and these other more experienced producers in the mix, and to try to bandy together, high quality, highly curated, and bound ourselves together for the things that make the most sense in doing so. So cross promotion, echo effect for audiences, using media effectively around a single brand. The Kickstarter campaign is probably the best example of how we're trying to monetize it. And so I haven't looked since we've been on, but the Kickstarter campaign had a real banner first 48 hours. And what we've been able to do is just continually leverage and find new audiences among the shows that we like. A really common question that Roman fields every day is, well, what are you listening to? What do you like? And we see an echo effect of that many times over. And since the Kickstarter campaign launched, we've had a flood of podcasters come to us say, how do I get in? What do I have to do? What are the criteria for Radiotopia?
Yeah.
So that's kind of exciting.
Yeah, and so you've raised almost $150,000 in the first 2 days, and your goal is $250,000. I mean, these are pretty big numbers. And we know people get their perks, and they get to produce the show if they give a certain amount. Where does that money go exactly?
Yeah, and one of the ways that we, not just the Kickstarter campaign, but we also do sponsorships. We also have donations that are outside of Kickstarter campaign, and so that money is, some money is shared equally across all. Some money is shared depending on the size of the show. We kind of adjust ourselves depending on the source of the revenue that comes in. And we knew right away, especially for shows that were very small, that in order to stabilize the production and increase the frequency of production, there had to be a level of revenue, of a guarantee that was coming to producers that gave them the room to produce. And so Radiotopia was founded with a grant from the Knight Foundation for us to do just that. Let's pool some back office resources, but let's give a guarantee to the producers so that they can stabilize themselves and just produce more. And I think that is a really important component, and we'll continually think about that as we grow. And part of the Kickstarter idea is to also figure out how we do build enough cash so that we can invite other shows to the mix. Okay.
And Andrew, I want to bring you into this too. You've been kind of following podcasts over the years, and you're seeing, Kerri's talking about having grants, Kickstarter campaigns, sponsorships. It seems like there's a lot more ways for kind of these independent podcasters to make money and survive. What do you think it is that's kind of driving a resurgence now?
Yeah, it's interesting because if you look at what you need to get podcaster to become a pretty advanced podcast user, it's actually not that easy for the average consumer to get into podcasts. Apple only recently started having a dedicated podcast app, and for folks who really like podcasts, it's not even that great an app. And if you're on Android, you actually have to go out of your way to download a client, and there's no real standard client across all platforms. So it is actually quite tough. And in fact, in some ways, the podcast listening audience is quite elite because of that. And maybe that's what people in the podcast world kind of like, So I always point to Slate as one of the folks who really made podcasting a cornerstone of what they do. The kinds of crowds that the Slate podcasts can get in terms of live audiences around the country are pretty amazing. I mean, Mike can talk more about that in terms of what kind of following they have. But I think Slate has really made podcasting a big part of what they do. And more and more you hear about folks who are big podcast listeners. They find it even harder to go throughout their day to do average tasks without a podcast in their ear all the time. So for me, it's almost like podcasts are like the Jiminy Cricket talking to me all the time, because I just get so much more information when I'm doing mundane tasks when that podcast is there, feeding me information in my ear all the time. To the point where I have to buy this thing, which is like a wireless Bluetooth thing, because my kids kept pulling the cord and damaging my ears when they pulled it out. So that's where my choice of technology is dictated a lot by how much podcasts have been useful to me. And I thought it might be interesting for Kerri and Mike to talk about the new thing that has topped the podcasting charts, which is the new Serial show from the This American Life folks, and that's a great example of kind of variable length programs and this really long narrative arc of just one story taking multiple weeks to go through. And that's kind of a cool thing that podcasts have been able to do, is to try these new form factors, as Mike said, and not be constrained by 30-minute blocks or 5.5-minute blocks here and there. The podcast can be exactly as long as they need to be when you're doing these things.
Yeah, Mike, do you want to jump in about just the freedom of form factors and also what's going on at Slate?
Yeah, well, first of all, just from an audience perspective, we need Andrew's ears. They're very important, his actual physical ears. Do not lose them. Curtail your kids. Yeah, so, I hope I'm the good angel and like Roman Mars is the bad angel, or maybe the other way around. Okay, so yes, Serial is amazing. I was listening to it thinking this is impossible without podcast. This is a show that should win, a Peabody Award. Well, it all depends on kind of if the guy was guilty or not, actually, doesn't it? But it should win some sort of award. It's done so well, and it's only possible. You couldn't do that for 12 episodes. It'd be very hard to do it for 3 episodes on This American Life. And so you're just inventing a form where you're saying, you can do it. It is a little bit based on that show on IFC, The Staircase. So it's sort of like a mini-series on TV, but, radio never had that before. And I think another thing with Slate is it's not just the format, it's the idea of we're going to have a roundtable political discussion, our first show, and the basic founding principle was, unlike the 20 or 30-minute version you get, and those are pretty good on This Week or on Face the Nation, we're just going to assume that you have a certain amount of knowledge, so it will be a bit more erudite than any other discussion you get, and just sort of pitching it to an audience that's 20, 40% above even the audience that wants to tune in to a network show, I think has proved really, really invaluable. And I think one of the reasons why podcasting has a great possibility to have long legs is what Slate is doing with, say, the political gab fest. You could replicate that if you have your own panel of great people, and maybe one would be a political gab fest more for millennials, and one would be it's nichifying everything. Podcast is the most, niche-tastic media I've ever thought of, and it's right in your ear, and it's not for no one else is listening to it as you're listening to it. So that's one of the reasons it has great possibilities. And yeah, I do think exactly what Andrew was saying. Almost all of the reason that podcasts have gotten more popular is ease of use, is that when they first came out, you used to have to plug a device into your computer and wait for the computer to download and then go from the computer to your device. Now you just hold it up to the air. And it's not really easy. I mean, you still have to do tutorials, and that is the biggest amount of friction. And I think it's a big reason why people over 65 just don't listen. And they would love podcasts if it wasn't so friction-filled in terms of getting the podcast. But I can't imagine that's not going to change and improve as, the medium gets bigger and companies are more incentivized to make a great app.
Yeah, we'll hope that happens, because it's amazing how difficult it still is even to this day.
Right.
Kerri,
and I think, I do think that the people who are inside it don't even realize, because we do it every day, but it is tough for the average person. It's a 4-step process, right?
Yeah.
Download the app. Maybe if you got an iPhone 6, it's already there. Download the app, select the show, subscribe to the show, then listen to the show. I mean, we're still so far behind radio, which is like, boom, one button. I'm listening to
Yeah,
the radio.
this is funny because she's showing kind of a how to listen to a podcast at Ira Glass. I mean, the fact that he has to have this explainer video to explain how to listen to a podcast is it's a little sad.
It is a matter of time, though. I mean, it is I just think that the quality of the content has been so great that it is like, Apple will figure this out and make it easier, and it is a matter of time before it becomes a one-step process. It is quite clunky. I'm glad that Serial was brought up because I think that it's another terrific example of the freedom when you're not in the confines of the broadcast clock, the kinds of experimentation you can do, and the chaptering of the story I think is really bold and interesting. We've experimented a little bit ourselves by in May we did a combined editorial theme with all of our podcasts in Radiotopia. It was called The Long Shadow, and each podcast did a little bit of their own take on the theme, and it did really well. And Leah Chow who produces Strangers just did a 4-part series called Love Hurt, so she's experimenting with that chaptering too. And there's all kinds of other stuff that's being toyed with and played with and tweaked, and people just letting their creative juices flow in, and because the medium is very intimate. People are mostly but not entirely listening with earbuds on, and so you can really get inside people's heads and play with that content in a really different way than you can on a broadcast platform. And so I really applaud This American Life and Serial for what they're doing. I think it's great. I think there's just more great stuff to come from that team.
Yeah, and we can't ignore the fact that radio serials were really all radio was about when it started out. I mean, this is kind of the birth of soap operas and things like that. It really started as serials on radio, so it's kind of an interesting Back to the Future moment. Andrew, one thing we talked about when we were talking about email newsletters is kind of the habits. How do you get into someone's habit? How do you make their reading, their listening, their viewing a habit? Because that's the most difficult thing to get, is this kind of loyal listener. As someone who likes listening to these podcasts, how does someone cross the line and become a habit for you?
I mean, it's hard. I mean, as Mike said, it's a multiple-step process. Even for me, on an iPhone with 64 gigs of memory, and I'm downloading these podcasts, and can I get it before I get into the car? And you have maybe, I think I checked like 2 gigabytes worth of storage just full of podcasts, and I have to prune it and get rid of old podcasts here and there. So it is quite hard to do that. To habitualize folks to this thing is quite tough. I think some of the networks that have done it the best are the ones that can just make themselves necessary. So, I think the network that really started getting folks behind it in terms of technology was the Twit network. So that was Leo Laporte and the kind of geeks who want tech podcasts or Mac podcasts. So they're kind of like their 3rd generation, and it's kind of interesting seeing now with the 4th generation of podcasters. So one of the folks that we were trying to get on was Tom Merritt, who now does the Daily Tech News show, and he's got an interesting way of making people kind of stakeholders in what's going on. So I think that's one way of habitualizing things. So he has no advertising at all. He's using Patreon.com to have people subscribe for, not even subscribe, just donate $12 a year, and people feel invested in it, and then they have a reminder that this is a podcast they should be listening to. And he clears 6 figures a year, so that's enough for someone to easily make a living on, because he has such a big following. So you kind of have your first generation, second generation of podcasters where they were built off of the blogging culture. Twit was kind of a 3rd generation, making a pure podcast network with advertising. And now we're seeing a lot of folks just going out there doing this patronage system, and they can get folks to just donate $12 or $15 a year, and you have enough folks with maybe 5,000 subscribers to make it a living. And you're seeing more and more folks jump onto the Patreon network to do that kind of thing.
And Kerri, at PRX, would you consider this kind of subscription model or donation model are you seeing more of that?
Oh, absolutely. And we already have a number of people who just, in processing their donation, they selected that they'd like to contribute monthly. So we are already seeing that in a passive way. And I think that'll probably be the next step for us in figuring out a decent subscription model so that we have, again, it's all about shoring up the production so that creative folks can keep doing their thing. And so we'll do, the reason why we chose to do Kickstarter this year is because we really are literally kickstarting this podcast network. It's very new, and the Kickstarter campaign gives us lots of visibility that we can use to attract sponsors and other donors and attract new listeners. It's a marketing campaign in and of itself. But I think after this, we'll be looking at expanding our subscription model. Definitely.
One of the things that Roman Mars says is, we're creating the public radio you deserve. And we've heard, we've often talked about people wanting to get the content that they want when they want it on their own time clock. They don't want to have to listen to a show at the time that it comes on. They want to kind of time shift and listen when they want. I mean, does this possibly, is it eventually the death knell of terrestrial radio in some way, or is it all going to kind of work together? What's your take on that, Mike?
I don't know. So many things have been posited as the death knell of commercial radio. I think that definitely, if most of NPR gets its money from stations, and what's the point of stations unless they're creating their own things? So here in New York, maybe it's an unfair example because they have so many resources, but they deserve their resources. WNYC goes and creates its own show, so it's vital. But if the only reason that you listen to public radio is a chance to listen to Morning Edition, All Things Considered, do you really need a station for that? The answer is yes, because they're building that into the model. They're making you listen to the station. They know they can't just put out Morning Edition on a satellite the moment it's done, or after the first feed, have it ready at 6 o'clock. That would destroy all these stations. Now, that's to say that it is sort of inevitable that the technology is going to blow up the model of stations paying NPR for its content. But there's so many walks of life and so many forms of media where, for 40 years, they've held on to an old model because it works and makes people money, right? Just now we're seeing HBO give you the over-the-top subscription only, and that's something they resisted for whatever it was, 10 years when the technology was available. So I don't know when it's going to end. I definitely do think that, there are many great things about NPR, and if we're eager to see NPR dismantled because it's a little old and a little bit of a dinosaur, think about all the great things and think about how hard it will be to replicate, 50 bureaus throughout the world and good coordination of that. And not just the amount of content, but, I think a trend that is hurting podcasts is it's very indulgent. And so many podcasts are so long. And I love comedy podcasts, but they go on for an hour and a half. And yeah, maybe there are 6 good jokes in there, but give me an edited show. And at least NPR, one great thing about NPR is there's only so much real estate. So I was thinking about this the other day. The columnist, the 800-word a column columnist who would produce a column 3 days a week, that's sort of a dying art. But I think 3 days a week, there's something to that. It gives you a time to collect your thoughts. And just the amount of reporters and the limited amount of real estate that NPR has kind of makes for great reporting. You can only get on the air a couple times a week. Make sure that those shots are worth it. So is the promise of a podcast, everyone can get on the air as long as they want with whatever they want. Is that a good thing? For Mike and the Gist, it is. For public radio in general, I don't know if it is.
Now, what do you think, Kerri? How are you seeing kind of terrestrial radio change now?
There are some incredible public radio stations out there that are local institutions and serve their communities really well and in very strong ways. And we don't see the radio going away anytime soon. We very much see these things as very complementary. And but the fact is that we have to change, we have to evolve, we have to go where technology goes. We have to let the content lead. We have to find audience, and we have to be nimble and innovative, and constantly try to improve. And that's from the content creator by themselves all the way up to the large institution that's serving a local community. I think that as stations are seen as merely repeaters for national programming, I actually do see that as a real vulnerability. But as they are creative in their own community and reach their listeners in a way that is relevant to their local station, I think those are the stations that will be strong and will continue to not only produce but play content that is really important. So it's all shifting, and I think that we're playing in all kinds of fields because we think that the sands are shifting.
You got to kind of play the field.
Yeah.
And so, Andrew, as our model listener, I don't know how you got that way, but anyway, how much podcasting are you listening to versus, let's say, turning on the radio to hear what's on the radio?
Oh, you don't want to know. I tell my students all the time, I think I get at least 60% of my news and content from podcasts now, and I think that's a result of having twin boys, walking the dog, driving an hour and a half a day, and it just syncs up with your lifestyle a lot better, right? You get to control when the audio is played. As I mentioned before, I play almost all my podcasts at 1.25x, so it's faster than real time, except for Mike, because I need to slow you down because you're so energetic and so dense with your info. I need to play you at real time. So most everyone else, I speed it up to meet my lifestyle, but it's one of those things where once you hit upon the right 5 or 10 podcasts that are high signal, as Mike said, it's easy to find lots of podcasts that go on very long, and the signal to noise ratio is not as good as others. But
are there radio shows among your podcasts?
There are. I mean, I do a lot of NPR. I do America's Test Kitchen from PRX folks. I kind of have the schedule as once a week, but then dailies, and then tech podcast, and journalism podcast, and media podcast, and so it really builds. But it's also kind of a good catch-all. So of course I do read a lot online, but having that well-curated feed of digested news stories or weekly roundups to make sure I catch everything is something I depend on for a podcast to do. So I'd love to see what new things come down the pike from both PRX and Slate, because I think they're two of the folks doing it the best right now.
And just to answer your question for you, you don't listen to the radio is what you're trying to say, right?
Yeah, it's almost like, I was a TiVo user back in 1990, whenever, so I stopped doing appointment viewing and appointment listening a long time ago. So podcasts, are definitely more in line with my TiVo-like thinking about, how to consume things. But, for local things, and there still is the role for the local NPR station, right? So here in DC, WAMU, local affairs programming, things that listening to it in the morning definitely benefits you in terms of what you do in the afternoon. So there are some things I do, live radio for those things, but it's more the exception than the rule these days.
I'll give you my stats.
Mike. Yeah, I want to hear yours, Mike.
I'm just looking through. I got 51 podcasts. I don't listen to them all, but there are 51 right here in this phone. And of those 51, I have one TV show, the Olbermann podcast, and I have 4 other radio shows. Colin McEnroe, which is the Connecticut public radio guy, best local talk show host. Fresh Air, Mike Francesa, who is a New York sports guy, and Brian Lair. So those are the only on-air podcasts that I listen to.
Do you listen to the radio? Would you turn on the radio to listen to something live?
Yeah, every morning. As the local radio station, like at 9, goes to BBC. Don't need the BBC. I'm an American. So I listen to NPR One, the new NPR app, which always starts off with the newscast at the top, which is great. And then I listen to like a West Coast radio station on the East Coast because it syncs up with my time more. I listen to the KCRW out of Santa Monica. That will be where I get Morning Edition because it's 3 hours earlier.
I also turn on the radio every morning. I listen to it. I have the same habits that Mike just said. There's a certain time when I turn it off, and then everything else is digital for me. But I also have 2 teenagers who their only interaction with the radio is when I'm around them, and it's not they don't have any other reason to have a radio, and I marvel at how much music they have in their devices, because every time I say, oh, where'd you hear about that music, they always answer, oh, it's on the radio, even though I know for a fact that they haven't had an interaction with a radio at which to know
Pandora or another internet radio.
Yeah, it's like a phrase they use that is a little bit of a holdover. But how they listen, their news. My kids do consume news, but it's all through texting and through headline. They're real headline grabbers, and how they mature and figure out how they're going to listen is going to be really interesting. And that's really why we all need to stay very current and very nimble on. And just keep creating the best content we can, and those production values. I do believe that moderate to low production qualities will just become part of the chatter, and the real good stuff is the stuff that the curators will come to the forefront and make sure that people are finding.
I just want to say, I think radio is a little underrated in terms of how much people actually use it, because I was just looking at how they make up the Billboard Top 100. So All About That Bass, the #1 song in the country, has 200,000 downloads last week, has about 13 million plays on Spotify and Pandora, and has 150 million listens on the radio. So it is still 10 times the amount of the on-demand services.
It's true.
But that's All About That Bass.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's changing, but it's true.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Well, thanks, you guys. Really appreciate the discussion. It's super interesting, and we'll be checking our habits on a regular basis to see how they change, and our kids. I want to thank our panel, Andrew Lih at American University, Fannie Cohen, our producer in New York, Kerri Hoffman at PRX in Vermont, Mike Pesca in his undisclosed location and booth. We want to thank PBS and the Knight Foundation for making this podcast possible. We want to thank Next Space and Next Kids for co-working and childcare in one place. You can learn more about them at nextspace.us/nextkids. We'll catch you each and every Friday right here at the Mediatwits and PBS MediaShift at mediashift.org. Thanks, everyone.